Let's give a big warm welcome to Dr. Ross joining us tonight. Hugh, we're so glad that you're joining us, that you're taking the time to be with us. We miss you around these parts, and we're looking forward to tonight. God bless you. I'll cut you loose, and then, Dr. Ross, whenever you're ready, you just call me right back up, and we'll go into Q&A.
Okay, that sounds really good. I've got a short presentation that I'm going to be showing you through my computer here. And during the Q&A time, and what I'm going to try to cover is the range of creation theology within the church. And in my talk, I'll focus on the perspective that the creation days are 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. Contrast that with the view we hold here at Reasons to Believe that there's 6 consecutive long periods of time. And during the Q&A time, feel free to ask me to address your question from a young earth perspective, an old earth perspective, theistic evolutionary creation, framework hypothesis, and whatever position you want me to defend. You know, I've debated all these people frequently enough that I think I can give the best answer that they would give from their perspective. And if you want, you can ask me to respond to the question from multiple perspectives. So that's what this evening is all about, is just to kind of see what the range of different possible interpretations of the book of scripture and the book of nature are. And incidentally, if some of you want to ask me a question that's got nothing to do with the topic tonight, I'm good with that too. So let me take over your computer. Let's just see if this works well. Well, I put this slide up first just to let you know that if you don't get your question answered tonight, I do take questions on both my Facebook and Twitter page. And for those of you who are interested, we at Reasons to Believe maintain a 24/7 YouTube channel. So feel free to take advantage of that. And if you want to dig deeper into the short talk I'm talking about this evening, you can get a free chapter of this book, A Matter of Days, where I deal with this subject in detail. Reasons.org/Ross. You can get a free chapter. I think we're giving away chapter 15. And then in terms of the exegesis of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's this book, Navigating Genesis, and we're giving away a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. And I suspect our chapter has these books at the back book table. So if you want to get the whole book, it should be right there. But what we're going to look at is the universe and the earth. Are they old or are they young? And I'm going to be focusing on what the Bible says. In the Q&A time, feel free to ask me the science questions, but in this brief talk, I'm just going to focus on what the Bible says about this issue. And I'm going to begin where both young earth and old earth creationists agree about what the Bible says. And I think it's important to realize there's much more agreement than there is disagreement. You know, a lot of non-Christians think that they don't agree on anything. That's simply not true. Both sides, for example, do agree that a transcendent, beyond space and time, supernatural being, a personal being, supernaturally created the universe. So there's no question about the fact that both sides believe that there's a God beyond the universe that created the universe. And both sides also agree that the Bible is wholly inerrant and must be read literally unless the context clearly indicates otherwise. And both sides would agree that all the creation texts in the Bible are meant to be taken literally and inerrantly. There's no figures of speech being used in these texts. And we at Reasons to Believe actually go one step beyond that. All of us here endorse all the affirmations and denials of the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. We do this. A lot of other creation organizations do not, but this is one thing that we require all of our scholars here to endorse on an annual basis. Both sides also agree that all of humanity is descended from Adam and Eve, whom God specially created less than 130,000 years ago. Now, there's a difference. A young earth creation will say something like 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. We believe it's between 10 and 130,000 years ago. Evolutionists will put it at about 1 million years ago. But both we and the young earth community do agree that human beings are the product of supernatural descent, or a descent from a supernatural creation of Adam and Eve by God. And both sides also agree that that the literal definitions for the word yom, the word translated as day in Genesis 1, includes a long but finite period of time. So there's no disagreement that there are four literal definitions for this word yom that's translated day. If you're interested, the four definitions, you'll see this in any lexicon. It can mean some of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. It can't be used for indefinite time. And there's also agreement on both sides that yom is the only word in biblical Hebrew for a long, finite period of time. There's a word for year, for example. There's a word for indefinite time, but yom is the only word in biblical Hebrew for a long, finite time period. Both sides also agree that the Bible is the only verbal, propositional, authoritative revelation from God. So sola scriptura, this doctrine from the Reformation, is held by both sides, and simply the recognition that only persons speaking actual words can wield authority and make propositional statements. Now, I'm going to first give you what are considered to be the best arguments from a young earth perspective based on biblical exegesis. I'm going to give you the best theological arguments, and then we're going to contrast that with the best old earth exegesis and old earth theology. And one big disclaimer, this is not a complete defense. I'm just picking the highlights, but from my experience, these are what are considered to be the best arguments from the two different sides. Young earth creationists will point out that the most frequently used definition for yom in the Bible is 24 hours. And incidentally, old earth creationists don't disagree with that. They would just make the claim that in the context of Genesis 1, they believe it refers to a longer period of time. But this is an argument that's made to support a young earth interpretation, that the vast majority of times the word yom appears in the Old Testament, it's used in the context of 24 hours. And also they make the claim that the most frequently used definitions for Arab, which is translated morning, and Boker, which is translated evening, in the Bible are in the context of 24 hours. Incidentally, both sides agree it can be referring to other definitions, but young earth creationists say these are the most frequently used ones. And then when it comes to the specifics of what's going on in the creation days, young earth creationists will point out that the third creation day vegetation cannot survive without the fourth creation day sun if the creation days are long time periods. So that's a frequent argument they make for why these days have to be much shorter periods of time. And then Exodus 20 is frequently brought up. Basically, young earth creationists look at Exodus 20, which is a reference to the 10 Commandments, and where it's referring to the commandment about keep the Sabbath. They look at that text as a Sabbath equation, namely that we're to look at our Sabbath, work for 6 days, rest on the seventh day, as being equivalent to God's work week, where he works for 6 24-hour days and rests for a 24-hour period. Young earth creationists will also say the Bible does not allow for death before Adam's sin. And they'll cite Romans 5:12, which says that death did not enter the world until Adam sinned, and Genesis 1:30, which makes the point that all life is dependent upon vegetation. They use that as an argument that there was no carnivorous activity until Adam's sin, no death until Adam's sin. And if that's the case, then clearly there can't be a long period of time before Adam sinned. And young earth creationists will point out that science is not trustworthy since creation has been corrupted by sin, citing Genesis 3:17, which says the ground is cursed because of you. And all young earth creationists, I mean, there's a spectrum of positions within the young earth creationist community, but they would argue that the laws of physics have changed at Adam's fall and a second time during Noah's flood. This is true of all young earth creationist models. And so With the change in the laws of physics, they're basically saying old Earth creationists can't cite science before the time of Noah or before the time of Adam to support their position. They'll also go to the New Testament and note that in Mark 10, Jesus called Adam's marriage the beginning of creation. And so this is interpreted by them as the beginning of the universe, being at roughly the same time as the beginning of Adam and Eve and their relationship as husband and wife. And then they'll also point out that Adam and Eve had the appearance of age when they were newly created, that they were immediately functional, and therefore they had the appearance of age, and hence all the scientific evidence for extreme age may be just simply appearance of age and not real age. Incidentally, old Earth creationists have got responses to all these arguments that are made by young Earth creationists. We can deal with that in the Q&A time, but I just wanted you to hear what they consider to be the best biblical evidences in support of their position. And then we'll briefly look at how old Earth creationists look at Scripture, and we'll begin with their exegesis of the Bible. And they will make the point that the seventh day of creation has not yet ended, pointing out, for example, that you've got an evening and a morning for the first 6 creation days, indicating that each day has a definite start point and a definite end point. When you go to Genesis 2, 1-4, there's no evening and morning phrase, which they interpret as implying that the seventh day is still continuing. And then they'll cite Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 that explicitly state that we're still in God's seventh day. We're to live our lives in such a way that we will be able to enter into God's seventh day, indicating the seventh day continues. They'll also point out Genesis 2, which describes a number of events that take place on creation day 6. Where you got Adam created. He works the Garden of Eden long enough to realize there's more to life than gardening. Then God has him name all the soulish animals, give them appropriate names for how God designed them to relate to Adam, each in their own different way. He is put to sleep. God performs surgery on him. He recovers from the surgery. And then he sees Eve, whom God has just created. And the word coming out of Adam's mouth, recorded in Genesis 2, is hapa'am, a Hebrew word that's used over 20 times elsewhere in the Old Testament, translated at long last. So old Earth creations will say, if you look at Genesis 2, that means, for example, Genesis 1 says God created both the human male and the human female on the 6th day, but Genesis 2 has a lot going on between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve, way too much to fit into a 24-hour period. That's the argument that is made. And then old Earth creationists will also cite Jeremiah 33, Romans 8, Revelation 21, several passages in Genesis and Isaiah, making the point that the Bible explicitly declares that the laws of physics have not changed from the moment of creation until the present day. And the laws of physics haven't changed, then that means the young Earth creationist models that critically depend on the laws of physics changing are invalidated. They'll also make the point that Genesis 1:2 places the reference frame for the creation days below Earth's atmosphere. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth, underneath the clouds, not above the clouds. And I'll also cite Job 38, which tells us in the context of the primordial Earth, God had wrapped the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. And so they will say that means that the sun was not created on the 4th day. It was created in the beginning along with the stars, but that the light of the sun doesn't appear on the surface of the earth until creation day 1. The text says, let there be light. That doesn't say that God created the light. That was earlier. And then creation day 4 says that creatures for the first time can actually see in the sky the position of the sun, moon, and stars. Hence, they see no problem with having vegetation before the sun becomes visible in the sky to the animals that God creates on day 5. He'll also point out that even within 24 hours, you got a problem if there's no sun for the plants. Plants can't survive even a nanosecond without the heat and the light of the sun. And then in terms of old Earth theology, they'll argue that what we see in Exodus 20 is not an equation, it's an analogy. And as evidence, they would cite Leviticus 25, 3-4, which talks about the agricultural land being worked for 6 years, and then how we're to give a Sabbath rest to the agricultural land of 1 year. And so the argument is that, since God has no biological limitations, his work days could be any period of time he wants, and his rest day could be any period of time he wants. And they would argue this is consistent with what you see in Genesis 2, where there's no closure on the 7th day. And as far as Romans 5:12 is concerned, they would argue and point out that the text says death through sin was visited upon all people. And they would make the point that of all the species of life on planet Earth, only humans can experience sin. And the text says death to all people. It does not say death to all life. And they would also point out that Genesis 1:30, where it talks about Adam and Eve being told to take good care of the vegetation, the green plants, and whether or not you got carnivorous activity, all life is dependent for their sustenance on green plants. It's the base of the food chain. And then old Earth creationists would also argue that you got passages throughout the Bible where God compares his eternal past existence to how long the rivers have been around, the mountains have been around, the hills have been around. And they would say that analogy would simply be inappropriate if the rivers and continents and hills were only a few thousand years old. And then they would also point out the 2 books doctrine as stated in the Bible, Psalm 19, verses 1-4, and Romans 1:18-20, state that the record of nature is a reliable, trustworthy revelation from God, proving his existence, proving his personal attributes. And as you see in Psalm 50 and Psalm 97, it actually demonstrates and declares the plan of salvation. Redemption is taught through the creation. And so in that case, they would counter the young earth claim that the book of nature is not a reliable revelation. They would point out that what's not reliable is our human interpretation. But the Bible is a pure word of God. The record of nature, likewise, is a pure word of God. It's our interpretation that is corrupted, not even one of those revelations. And then old Earth theology would also make the point that the laws of physics play a crucial role in the eradication of evil, citing Romans 8:23 and Revelation 21, which basically states that these laws of physics remain in effect until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have been redeemed and evil's been eradicated from God's creation. And so they would also argue that these laws of physics cannot have changed since the moment of creation, since they play such a crucial role in God's purpose. God created the universe for the specific purpose to be a tool in his hand to eradicate evil. And they'd also make the point that in Genesis 3:17, the ground was cursed because of human sin. It doesn't say the laws of physics were cursed, or the universe was cursed, or the earth was cursed. It was the ground that was cursed. It was cursed because of human sin. And the point simply there is that because of human sin, the ground, the agricultural ground, simply will not produce in the way that God intended because of human abuse. And we see plenty of evidence that human abuse indeed does degrade the productivity of the agricultural land. Okay, I got about 3 more minutes. What I'm going to do very quickly with the last 3 minutes is basically talk about the flood of Noah. And the reason why is that the global flood interpretation came before young earth creationism. It was people reading the Bible and believing that it taught a global flood that gave birth to young earth creationism. A lot of people think it's the other way around, but the history shows you that the global flood interpretation came first, and young earth creationism followed thereafter. So just very quickly, what does the Bible say about the extent of Noah's flood? And the debate here is whether or not it's actually global, covering the entire surface of the earth, or simply the surface of the earth that was inhabited by human beings. And the point there is that the Bible makes a claim, and this, by the way, is the exegetical case for a global flood, predominantly based on Genesis 7:19, where the text says of the flood waters, they rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. And I put in brackets there alternate definitions for high and alternate definitions for hill in the Hebrew. And as you move on into Genesis chapter 8, we see in the context of Noah with the receding of the floodwaters, Genesis 8:5, the tops of the mountains or hills became visible to Noah. But later in the text, in verse 9, we've got Noah releasing the dove. So we got Noah on top of the ark, the dove flying low over the water. And the text tells us that when Noah released the dove, from the dove's perspective, the dove could only see water over the whole face of the earth. The dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. Basically making the point, you got the same phrase here in Genesis 8:9 that you do in Genesis 7:19, and therefore it may not be that Genesis 7:19 is referring to the entire surface of the planet. Okay, I got 1 minute left, so I'm going to cut this really short and basically make the point that the Bible is filled with worldwide events where it says the whole world was included. And these are some of the passages. Job 41 refers to Joseph feeding the whole world. But if you read all the passages referring to this, it actually tells us he was feeding the peoples of the Egyptian Empire. So that was the whole world from his perspective. 1 Kings 10, it says Solomon entertained the kings and queens of the entire world. But if you read on, it tells us that he was entertaining the kings and queens from as far away as Ethiopia and as far away as Samaria and Babylon. Acts 2:5 talks about how the gospel was going out throughout the whole of the Roman world. Romans 1:8, Paul says of the Romans, their faith has been heard throughout the whole world. And then you also got a similar passage in Colossians. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more we could say about the flood, but I'm going to hold to my promise, stop here and take your questions. And I'll begin wanting to address your questions from any perspective that you would like. Let me see if I can get you back in here.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. We appreciate it. You're smart. That's what I got to say. I want to kind of give us, thank you. Just super clear, very helpful, understandable. We really, really appreciate you. So what we're going to do is Phil's going to man this mic, and feel free to ask a question as well, and the same with you, Eric. And here's little ground rules, just because we have many people in here that may have questions. I just simply ask that if you have more than one question and there's somebody behind you, just do one question, go back to the back, and then you can ask more than one. Just do one at a time, so that way we have several that have questions. They can have plenty of time to have Dr. Ross respond. So with that.
And Dr. Ross can see us.
Yeah. Dr. Ross has visuals on us too, so we'll just kind of go on back and forth, and I may jump in and interrupt. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Dr. Ross. Thank you for your information. I have a question. My question is, it's my understanding that the moon is moving away from the Earth maybe a few inches every year. So if it is, then if the Earth was billions of years old, you would have to multiply inches by billions of years, but times billions. And wouldn't that put the Earth, the moon, it would be impossible?
Okay, that's a good question. And yes, if the moon were moving away from the Earth at the same rate that we measure today, that would show that the moon had to be younger than about 3.5 billion years. So that's not of much comfort to young Earth creationists. But the truth is, the moon has not been spiraling away from the Earth at the same rate throughout the history of the Earth. Astronomers believe that the moon was formed about 90 million years after the Earth. So I would make the moon about 4.45 billion years old. But given that the moon does not move away from the Earth at the same rate throughout its whole history, the best models for the recession of the moon from the Earth are consistent with it being 4.45 billion years old. So this is not considered to be a problem in astronomical dynamics.
Hey, Dr. Ross. I had a question about Joshua 10, 12, 13, and 14, where it mentions the sun and the earth stood still for, it's kind of unclear, maybe a day. Is there any
Right.
explanation for that, or have you researched that at all?
Yes, you can actually get a video from us where we go into some depth on Joshua's long day and Hezekiah's sundial, because these are two passages that people have interpreted as an actual adjustment in the orbit of the earth about the sun. In both the Isaiah text and the Joshua text, I'll give you first what it says in the Joshua text. It talks about how there's either an extended period of light or an extended period of darkness in the valley of Ajalon. When you read it in the original Hebrew, it's not declaring that God somehow stopped the rotation of the earth or moved the sun in some dramatic way. What it is saying is that he gave to Joshua and his troops an extended period either of daylight or of darkness that lasted about 24 hours. And most Hebrew exegetes believe the text favors extended darkness as opposed to extended light. And I've been to the valley of Ajalon. It's a small valley in the Negev desert that's ringed by hills, and it's very hot there and dry. So I can see that there would be an advantage to having an extended period of darkness or twilight so that Joshua continued the battle. It'd be very difficult to do that in the heat of the day. But you can get the video on this. There is a rumor that scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory or NASA have actually proven Joshua's long day by the use of solar eclipse measurements from before and after Joshua's long day. It's simply a rumor because the truth is the ancients did not record solar eclipse events with sufficient accuracy before Joshua's long day to either prove or disprove the event. Now it comes tantalizingly close for Hezekiah's sundial. The book of Isaiah says that the shadow of the sun moved back, shadow caused by the sun's light on the sundial moved back 40 minutes of time. Now we're in an era where we do have measurements of the dates and times of solar eclipses. But once again, it's not accurate enough to prove something as small as a 40-minute discrepancy. But again, you can get the details in the DVD we make available at reasons.org.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
I assume you've seen The Big Bang as well as Interstellar, the movie?
Interstellar, yeah, I did see Interstellar.
Well, in the movie, the faster you go, the slower time gets. Okay? So if there was this Big Bang, it's possible that what seems to be billions of years to us was fractions of a second. Okay?
Yes, this is a model that's frequently, for example, Russell Humphrey speaks about this in the books that he's written. And you'll see a detailed response to that in my book, A Matter of Days. He's basically appealing to gravitational time dilation. And that's what happens when you get inside a black hole. It's what would happen we could get really close to the singularity event of the universe. But to try to claim that Genesis 1 is speaking about a black hole that became a white hole in the context of gravitational time dilation is a problem, because in order to get any significant time dilation, you need extreme mass densities. And the densities are so extreme, no stars are possible, no planets are possible, no life is possible. No protons or neutrons or electrons are possible. It's quite different from velocity time dilation, where life can actually tolerate that, but life cannot tolerate any kind of gravitational time dilation. Made for a good movie, but there's no way. I forget the name of the actors that went into the center of that black hole in Interstellar, but I was laughing. I was looking at it saying, yeah, I mean, you're even when you get close to the event horizon of a black hole, your body gets stretched out into a long string of fundamental particles. And as you get closer to the event horizon, the particles get destroyed. That all happens long before you can measure any significant time dilation. So mathematically, it's possible. Physically, it's impossible. It only works for science fiction.
Okay, and my second comment is the genealogy of Jesus is in the Bible. Okay?
Yes.
And it was a time period of only 4,000 years.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that genealogy you see in the Bible is not an exhaustive genealogy. I mean, for example, if you go to the New Testament genealogy of Jesus, you'll see a whole lot of names that are mentioned in Chronicles are not included in the New Testament genealogy. It basically gives you 3 sets of 14 names, and there's a whole lot more than 14 generations in each case. This is true of all biblical genealogies. Basically, you're getting a selection of individuals in the complete genealogy. And I think what a lot of people miss is the names that are included are all intended to make a theological point. So, for example, as you compare the different genealogies, especially in the Old Testament, you'll see that some make a particular point of mentioning the women as opposed to the men. Others will make a point of mentioning people who are in significant sin. So, like one genealogy talks about the prostitute, and also talks about Judah and Tamar. And so it's basically making the point: the gospel offer of salvation is for men and women. It's for people who've committed terrible sins. As long as they've repented, they can become part of the family of God. So looking for those theological points, when you get into Genesis 5 and 11, each genealogy mentions only 10 names. And we know names have been dropped because there's an 11th name that's mentioned in the genealogy in Luke. And I'm wondering too, if what's happening in Genesis 5 is it's mentioning the names of the patriarchs who died a natural death or taken by God to heaven. Because we know that about 95% plus of human beings at that time were dying, were having their life ended, being terminated by being murdered by their fellow man. So what we may be getting here are the few individuals that escaped being murdered by their fellow man. But again, if you pick up the book Navigating Genesis, you'll see a detailed description of the genealogies. And incidentally, Old Earth and Young Earth creationists both agree that there are gaps in the genealogies. It's basically a debate about how many gaps. And if you go into the theistic evolution camp, they argue for a huge number of gaps. They're actually trying to extend those genealogies to accommodate millions of years. And I would argue that it can accommodate easily 100,000 or 50,000, but stretching it out to millions, I think that's out of character with how many names we see dropped from the other genealogies in the Bible. I mean, I would expect them to be roughly similar in which names they include and which names they drop.
I also had a question about, you said that sin only affected men and it resulted in death. But I was just curious, like Romans 8:20 says, all creation groans because it was made subject to vanity unwillingly. And then
Right.
also in Isaiah 24, verse 5 and 6, it talks about the earth being destroyed by the curse because the inhabitants broke the everlasting covenant. So how do you interpret those scriptures there?
Well, as far as your last point goes, the Hebrew word arrest that used in that text has 5 distinct literal definitions. And I believe with respect to what Isaiah is saying, it's basically making a point. Your land, your nation has been ruined because of your behavior. And, we see that happening frequently in human history, where agricultural productivity, for example, plummets because of the abuse of the human inhabitants therein. What you're seeing in Romans 8:18 through 22 is the reference that the entire universe is subject to a pervasive law of decay. This is also repeated in much more detail in the book of Ecclesiastes. And you probably recall by making the point that the Bible frequently states in different texts that the laws of physics are constant. They don't change. They remain in effect until what you see in Romans 8:23, that law of decay is in effect from the moment of the creation of the universe until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have been redeemed. And I've written a book called Why the Universe is the Way It Is. It might be out at the back table, where I make the point that especially the law of entropy, that second law of thermodynamics, what the Bible calls the law of decay or the law of corruption, is crucial for restraining the expression of human sin. It's because of thermodynamics that the more we humans sin, the more we propagate evil, the more work we have to do, the more time we waste, and the more pain we experience. And so the laws of physics actually operate in such a way to put a check on the spread of human evil to a sufficient degree that people realize I need God's help in order to overcome what I can't do for myself. And those laws of physics remain in effect until evil no longer is a factor. I mean, if you look at Revelation 21, there is no law of decay in the new creation. There's no gravity. There's no electromagnetism. Those laws are no longer necessary because there's no possibility for evil or sin in the new creation.
Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening.
Out of curiosity, I was wondering, what's your honest opinion on the Big Bang Theory?
Are you talking about the TV show or you're talking about...
No.
Yeah, that one. No.
That one? Okay.
No, the actual theory, the scientific theory.
The scientific theory, sure. The Big Bang was very much opposed by astronomers when it was first proposed in 1925. And incidentally, it was proposed by a Roman Catholic priest, George Lemaitre. He was the first one to suggest that the Big Bang was the correct understanding of the origin of the universe. But it got a lot of opposition from atheists and agnostics because of its biblical implications. I mean, this was a factor of my coming to faith in Christ. I was not raised in a Christian home. When I began to read the Bible in my late teenage years, I realized that it taught that the universe has a beginning that includes the beginning of space and time itself, that it teaches that the universe continuously expands from its space-time beginning, that it expands under laws of physics that don't change, where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. And that means that we live in a universe that gets progressively colder and colder as it gets older and older. And so the reason why the Big Bang Theory got so much opposition in the early part of the 20th century was because non-Christian astronomers saw the biblical implications and said, we can't do this. This is just too supportive of what the Bible teaches. They also reacted because the Big Bang did not give enough time for Darwinian evolution. Whatever illusions the biologists had, the astronomers knew if it's only billions of years old, that's not enough time to sustain any naturalistic model for the origin and history of life. And so there actually wasn't young universe, old universe debate for the first 50 years of the 20th century. The old universe astronomers were wanting to have the universe a quadrillion years old or older in order to give enough time for Darwinian evolution, but also because they thought that stars were burning for trillions of years. This is before they had any understanding of nucleosynthesis. And then you had the Big Bang people saying, no, it's young. It's only billions of years old. And then in the latter part of the 20th century, the astronomical evidence became overwhelming, and particularly through our ability to measure the past temperature of the universe. And those measurements show us that the universe has been cooling over its history at exactly the rate that the Bible predicted thousands of years ago. So I look at the Big Bang as something that's very supportive of Christianity, because it shows us how the Bible thousands of years ago accurately predicted future scientific discoveries and predicted them in detail, in sufficient detail that we can look at the cooling curve of the universe that we measure and contrast that with what you get from those biblical texts that talk about the beginning, the expansion, the constancy of physics, and how all of the universe is subject to a pervasive law of decay. Again, if you want to read more about this, it's in the book, A Matter of Days, and the book where I write about it in detail, The Crater and the Cosmos, 4th edition.
So in the charts you had about the New Earth theories, you mentioned the argument of changing physical laws. I guess I'd never heard that before. What are they using as, or citing as, the proof that that happened?
Well, the Young Earth Creationist community did publish a book called The Rate Project, and which is basically analysis of radiometric decay, in which they do concede that if the laws of physics don't change, the Earth and the universe must be billions of years old. But then they argued that the laws of physics do change, and in particular, they argued that the radiometric decay rates were millions, if not billions of times faster in the past than they are today. And they do cite situations where we do see a slight change in the radiometric decay. But by slight, I mean like 0.1%, where you got extreme pressures and temperatures, which will alter the radiometric decay rate by a tiny amount. Probably their best argument is they will look at rocks that have been dated to be billions of years old and say, well, the uranium and the thorium and the lead in those rocks is consistent with the Earth being billions of years old, but not the helium. And what they're referring to is how uranium and thorium undergo radiometric decay, and they decay into certain isotopes of lead and then helium-4. And they basically make the point that the helium we see is not consistent with billions of years. Now, old Earth creationists will point out that helium is the slipperiest atom we know of in the periodic table. In fact, I've worked with helium when I was an undergraduate student and also as a graduate student. And it's extremely difficult to contain helium, particularly liquid helium. I mean, it just escapes out of anything. And the point is, you can't use residual helium as an argument for the age of a rock. The rock simply will not contain it. It'll go into the rock and out of the rock at will. And uranium and thorium are continuing to decay. So helium's always being infused into the rock and also can go out of the rock. But the lead isotopes are very stable. They do not diffuse hardly at all. Likewise, uranium and thorium. And the thorium-232 decays into lead-209, uranium-235 to lead-208, and then you got uranium-238 decaying into lead-206. And keep in mind, lead only comes from the radiometric decay of heavy radioisotopes. So this is why geophysicists are so confident they got a really accurate age for the Earth, because they measure these primordial rocks and meteorites where they actually get 6 independent measures of the date of the rock or the meteorite. You get an uranium date, 2 uranium dates, a thorium date, and you get 3 lead dates. And they all give the same answer, 4.5662 billion years ago, plus or minus 0.0001 billion. And then the thing about helium too is potassium-40 decays into argon. Potassium decays 39 decays into argon, and argon is a heavy gas. Helium is a very light gas. Argon is a heavy gas. Earth's atmosphere is 1% argon. All of it comes from the decay of potassium. And the amount of argon we see in Earth's atmosphere makes up 1% of our atmosphere. That's consistent with the Earth being 4.57 billion years old. And for what it's worth, the moon has an argon atmosphere as well. Very small one, but again is consistent. So, but that is the best young Earth argument. They cite helium.
Hi, Dr. Ross. As you can see, this question is from a woman, an older one for that matter. My question is, when God created Eve from Adam's ribs, did he make Eve the same age as Adam or younger?
Okay, good question. And this is coming from an old man. So the text says that God took something from Adam's side. It's not necessarily a rib, and it doesn't tell us how much he took from Adam's side, but he did have to recover from surgery. So a significant piece was taken out of Adam's side, and then God used that and probably the dust of the earth as well to make this creature Eve. And when he made Eve, he made her brand new. I believe the same thing's true of Adam. Now, often we get the idea that Adam and Eve are both evidence for appearance of age because of their height and their capability, but neither one of them came from the womb of a woman. So their size would be no indication of their age. And I think the reason why God made them full size when he created them, he wanted to be able to communicate with them quickly. And, you know, a full-sized human has a brain 3 times bigger than that of a baby, and which means that Adam and Eve would be able to get language facility much more rapidly than a baby does. And you kind of see that in Genesis 2 and 3, that God was able to communicate verbally with Adam and Eve apparently relatively quickly. And that would be possible if God made them full size. But I would argue their size was no indication that they were older. No, they were brand new. I don't think Adam and Eve had any scar tissue on their bodies when God created them. I don't think they had any liver spots on their bodies. If you were to look carefully at me, you would see liver spots. Matter of fact, if you look carefully at a teenager with a microscope, you will also see liver spots. I don't think there are any on the newly created Adam and Eve.
Dr. Ross, we know that personality passes on through DNA. We see a lot of similarities, both men and women, regardless. And I also noticed in the Old Testament, primarily Exodus and Numbers, that generational curses are present, even to the 3rd and 4th generation. But there's also chances for redemption. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, I think this is an area that we should be researching. I've been challenging both Christian researchers and non-Christian researchers. We need to dig into this because there may be something going on beyond mere physical genetics when we procreate. Because the Bible does say that the sins of the parents can be passed on to the 3rd and 4th generation, and that the righteousness of the parents can be sustained to the 3rd and 4th generation, which tells us there's something of a spiritual nature that happens when we procreate. And I believe in dualism. I believe that every human being is not just a physical entity, they're also a spiritual entity. But it'd be great to actually do some actual research where we studied the personalities and the behaviors and the philosophy and the theology of a family through several generations and actually put this to the test. But so far, I don't know anybody who's actually wanting to do these kinds of experiments.
Hello, Dr. Ross. I was wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit more on the reason why the created evolution theory falls short because of the biological problem that you briefly mentioned.
Well, a couple of resources you can get. We did a 2 Views book with the scientists and theologians of Biologos. They hold to either theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism. where they believe that there's a natural explanation under God's control for the origin and history of life, whereas we believe that you need supernatural interventions, many of them. So that book is available. And then we also did a 4 Views book. It's called 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design. I co-authored that book with Deborah Harzma, the president of BioLogos, Steve Meyer, the president of the Discovery Institute, and Ken Ham, the president of Answers in Genesis. And there you can see the different views on this. But one reason why I don't hold to an evolutionary perspective is that, number one, we've been attending Origin of Life research conferences where often we're the only Christians in the audience. And we've written a book on the origins of life, is now in a 2nd edition. But we notice at these Origin of Life research conferences, and also we've read very deeply in the scientific literature in the origin of life, is it becomes clear there's no possible natural explanation for the origin of life. Origin of life researchers admit that you don't have a naturalistic explanation. They think they're going to come up with one. As an astronomer, as a physicist, I think we can actually rule out the possibility of a naturalistic explanation. We've written why in our book, Origins of Life. Just the homochorality problem by itself, I think, is sufficient to rule it out. And then as we get into the history of life on planet Earth, what I notice is that our friends that are theistic evolutionists and evolutionary creationists had not taken into context the changing physics of the sun. I mean, it tells us in Psalm 104, it's the property of all life to die off, but that God recreates and renews the face of the earth. As an astronomer, I can tell you the sun is a little more than 20% brighter than what it was when God first created life on planet Earth. Life can only tolerate about a 1% change. What God has been doing throughout the history of life on planet Earth is step by step removing life and replacing with new life, where that new life removes more greenhouse gases from the atmosphere than the previous generations of life. And God's been doing this step by step throughout the entire history of life. And my point is this: only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun will know which life to remove from the earth and which new life to replace that with, and what kind of diversity and abundance and what geographical distribution. If you get any one of those wrong, you get out of sync with the physics of the sun, and the entire planet becomes permanently sterile of life. And so just the longevity of life on planet Earth, I would argue, is proof that God has been supernaturally intervening throughout all the things we see in the fossil record, the mass extinction events that are always quickly followed by mass speciation events. And the rapidity with which we see these mass speciation events tells us that this is not a naturalistic explanation. In my book, Improbable Planet, I cite quotes from 7 paleontologists, none of them believers, who all make the point that when it comes to the Avalon explosion of life and the Cambrian explosion of life, there isn't a possible naturalistic explanation. That's just 2 of several examples we see of these rapid mass speciation events that are optimized to compensate for the changing physics of the sun.
Bill, sorry. We'll do 2 more questions just to watch our time here. So we'll go 1, 2.
So, Dr. Ross, how do atheist scientists explain that there's the laws of physics? Who wrote the laws of physics? Just like, for example, Jesus, when he broke the laws of physics by walking on the water and doing these miracles, he could do that because he wrote the laws of physics. Right. And also the DNA code, it's so highly sophisticated. Who wrote the code?
Well, this is an argument that you can use by analogy. Is that okay? In fact, I just wrote an article on our reasons.org website, citing an article written in Nature, written by an Origin of Life researcher, not a believer, himself an atheist, but he wrote this article called The Hand of God Dilemma. He says, we make all these amazing achievements in our chemistry labs, where we're duplicating tiny steps of what we know is necessary for the origin of life, but it only works if we're using pure chemicals, where we control the amounts and we ensure that no contamination gets in. He says, without the interference of the hand of the chemist, who is highly educated, well-trained, with a lot of technology and money, it doesn't work. And basically makes the point, this is a terrible analogy for what was happening on the early earth, but it's a great analogy for the hand of God. I mean, here you got an intelligent chemist, highly educated, well-funded, and they're able to duplicate tiny little steps of what God did in the beginning. But it always falls far short what we actually see in the origin of life. In spite of all of our technology and all of our money, we're not able to make life in the lab. We're able to make adjustments, but we're not able to make life from scratch in the lab, which tells us somebody a whole lot more intelligent, more knowledgeable, better funded, with better technology must have done it 3.8 billion years ago. And so that argument can be used repeatedly in all the scientific disciplines. Are what we're seeing going on in the record of nature consistent with someone far more intelligent and knowledgeable and powerful than us? Or is it consistent with a natural process where there is no mind, there is no intellect, there is no purpose, there is no plan?
Hello, Dr. Ross. I'm curious if you could give some high-level thoughts on string theory, and specifically, how many dimensions do you think there are?
Yeah, I write about this in my book, Beyond the Cosmos. Hopefully it's at the back table back there. It's now in a 3rd edition. And it's chapter 3, where I write about string theory. And string theory was actually developed by some friends of mine at Caltech some 20 years ago. And it was based on the fact that if we try to explain both cosmology and particle physics in the context of length, width, height, and time, there simply isn't enough room for all the symmetries required by quantum mechanics, gravity, and general relativity. And so that was their first clue that the universe must have more dimensions of space than just length, width, and height. And initially, they knew the answer was somewhere between 8 and 26 space dimensions. We now know the correct answer is 9 dimensions. In addition to the 3 big space dimensions, there are 6 extremely tiny dimensions that are wrapped very tightly around the 3 big dimensions. I want to be clear, however, string theory is not the only 9-dimensional particle physics theory that's out there. There are many other theories. It's one of a family. And so string theory may not be true, but I am convinced that what is true is that there's 6 tiny space dimensions that accompany the 3 large dimensions. And in terms of cosmology, you've got these 9 dimensions of space rapidly expanding from the cosmic creation event. But very early in the history of the universe, when gravity separates out from the other 3 forces of physics, that's when 6 of these space dimensions stop expanding. So 3 dimensions are expanding right through to the present. There are 6 dimensions of space that stopped expanding when gravity separated out. And that happened when the universe was 10 to the minus 43 seconds old. However, the reason I write about this in Beyond the Cosmos, it's proof that the God that created the universe is a God that's able to work and operate in at least the equivalent of 11 space-time dimensions. And the book is filled with all the theological paradoxes that the Bible talks about and how they can be resolved in a context of a God that's powerful enough to create 10 space-time dimensions and operate completely independent of the 10 space-time dimensions that he imputed to the universe. So things like the Trinity, things like how Jesus in 6 to 9 hours on the cross could atone for the sins of every human being who ever lived, how you resolve human free will and divine predestination, those are resolvable if we allow God to be as big as what the Bible declares and what the new physics now proves that indeed he must be.
Let's give Dr. Ross a big hand for joining us tonight.